Joining us is John Smotherman, the author of The Consciousness Paradigm, a book on raising your consciousness. John, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
We have to start with the question right off the bat. What started you down this path on becoming more aware of raising consciousness?
Well, what started me on the path is early in my life I started trying to figure out what life was. Why are we here? What are we doing? What are the people around me doing? What's the meaning of all this? And so I started looking at myself, my family, my community, the world, and I began to see things in the world that I didn't like, I wasn't happy about. I couldn't wrap my brain around why innocent children were starving in Africa. I couldn't wrap my brain around kids that were being abused by parents. I couldn't get my mind around women being beaten up by their husbands. All these very difficult things that were going on in society and the world. And it seemed like more ought to be able to be done about it than what was actually being done. And so about somewhere around the age of 13, 14, I kind of took the weight of the world on my shoulders and I spiraled into a pretty deep depression. And that made me very unhappy. I experienced a lot of distress. And the only outlet I had really was reading. And so I read and I read and I read and finally came across some very helpful things. And one of the things that kept being talked about again and again and again was quality of life is more heavily influenced by how you operate your mind than any other factor. And I saw that across people in various cultures and stages of life, and even Epictetus is a great example. He was a slave, lived miserable conditions, but he said if you will control your mind, you can still be happy. And I thought, well, if a guy who's a slave can find a way to be happy, I ought to be able to do it too. So I started looking at how I was using my mind, and I began to change things and think, well, okay, if I thought a little bit differently about this, what would happen? And I would change my mind, and then my life would change. And I was like, well, that's pretty interesting. And so I would try it again, and something else would change, and I began to realize that just about all of the misery that I had in my life was self-created. I had created it within my own mind. And so when I began that process of changing my mind and making myself happier and improving my life, I saw this pattern in this spiral. So I worked my way out of depression, and I thought, if I can go from being pretty miserable to okay, why not go from okay to being really good? And so I kept developing and working on it, and that was kind of the beginning of my interest in this area.
Oh, and it's interesting too, because not only are you a public speaker and an author, you also are a practicing attorney.
Yes.
And how do you bring what you've learned into that, or how has that affected your learning on raising your consciousness?
That's a really good question. The way they have intersected, they actually work together very well, and it kind of produces a synergistic effect, because on the one hand, I spent years and years reading esoteric philosophy on the mind and consciousness and the soul and all that kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, I've had this life experience of paying the bills, and to do that I've worked as a lawyer, which is a very pragmatic field. All day long you're working with people to solve very difficult, challenging, thorny problems. So on the one side of me I had all this theory from what I'd read and studied, and then on the other side I had this very pragmatic side of being an attorney, and I'm like, okay, how do I take what I know and put it in a form where it's very useful, where the average person can take all 3,000 years of human wisdom and drill it down and apply it in a way that's going to make their life better. All the theory in the world is great, but it doesn't do you any good if you can't actually apply it and make changes in your life to make your life better. So I use the attorney in me to force practicality within all the theory that I had read.
It's a really good point, because a lot of people, that's the first thing they're going to ask is, all this theory is great. how am I going to apply this?
Right.
What does this mean to me on a daily basis
Right.
going through my life?
Exactly. And that was the question that I felt like needed to be answered, that was not being answered very effectively. And so that's where my journey took me, is how can I fill in this gap?